Hello, everyone. This is a workshop from Gamecity Hamburg all about playtesting for indie games. Our workshop host is Steve Bromley, who worked before for PlayStation and shared his knowledge about user research and playtesting in AAA games and indies alike. This is a condensed version of his playtesting kit. Please be aware of that and Google him if you want to know more about his playtesting kit or his book about user research. Enjoy the workshop.
you can use, you can use as participants for your playtests. And so I thought it'd be helpful to share some things that can go wrong, some approaches, and how to make the most of that time you're going to spend with users. A little bit about my background, Centre already very helpfully described. So I've been a games user researcher for 12, 13 years now. I used to be a senior user researcher at PlayStation for many years, and since then I work with game teams as a consultant or an outside freelancer to help them do this. I do a lot of mentoring. I set up the IGDA's mentoring program to teach people how to do this as a career, how to be a games user researcher. And through my time, both at PlayStation and since, I've been lucky enough to work on many titles of teams of different sizes. And what I think that's reinforced to me is the impact that even a single playtest can have. Some of these smaller teams could only fit in 2, 3 rounds of playtesting throughout their development life cycle. But because these smaller teams are much more nimble and much more able to react, the value of any of those individual sessions can be huge. And that's what I'm really enthusiastic about unlocking with you through our conversation today. Also, as mentioned, I wrote a book about games user research, how to be a games user researcher, and I made a kit to help people do that. But you don't need the kit because we're going to talk about it today. So on to today, because I know we don't have a huge amount of time. So I very briefly want to touch on the mindset for playtesting and try and explain actually why are we doing this and what are we hoping to get out of it so that we're all starting on the same page. And then I think the meat of what we'll talk about is 8 tips for making the most of your public playtests, some things that can go wrong or some things that you missed opportunities, and making sure that you're at least aware of some of the mistakes I've made before so you can make exciting and new mistakes instead of just repeating those same mistakes that we've seen before. So first of all, about the mindset of playtesting. As I'm sure everyone on this call knows, game development is risky. Every day, every week, hundreds of games are released on Steam, and many of those sell less than 100 copies. And the vast majority of studios are under a huge amount of pressure and often fold after releasing their first game. And when you look and talk to teams about success and their approach, often there are three themes or 3 reasons why their games might lack that commercial success that they were after. The first is production risk. Something went wrong with how they're making games, and they failed to make a game by the time they thought they were going to. And producers and solo devs and small teams use a lot of techniques such as prototyping and iterative development and scoping very carefully to try and manage that. The second is market risk. Actually, if you made the perfect game, would there be anyone to buy it? And again, there's a lot of work that teams do to calculate the market size and understand the purchase behavior of their players, and starting building a community and doing marketing early to manage that. The one I'm most interested in, and our focus today, will be experience risk. So when you've made your game, will players understand what it is and how it works? And will players enjoy the thing that you're putting into the world? If you fail to make a game games are player experience. So if you fail to make a game that has a positive experience or has the experience that players are after or understand, it will lead to poor retention, poor reviews, poor word of mouth. It'll be much harder to get wish lists and to get on, get that momentum you need on Steam. And so we want to mitigate that. And that's what we're trying to do with playtesting. Luckily, playtesting has always been a part of game development, and it's risk reduction for that experience risk. You want to expose what's going to confuse players, what bits of the game are resonating, what bits of the game are difficult or confusing. And you want to do that as early as possible so you have more options for iteration, more options for changing direction. You want to manage that experience risk that we talked about. Now, as we'll talk about, it's not rocket science. There are lots of people out there who have expensive degrees and have done expensive courses who say, yes, I'm a PhD in games user research. But really the mindset is achievable to all of us and something we should all be applying in our practice. The mindset and the things that we want to achieve is giving some time to focusing on doing it correctly, making sure that we are creating some time amongst all the other conflicting demands of priority or other priorities in our time to do this. And also the spirit of neutrality, make sure that what we're after is actually finding the truth, finding the biggest risks and de-risking them, which, as we'll talk about in the tips, is what we'll try and achieve with our public playtests. And this kind of playtesting is useful throughout development. Right from the very first stage of ideation, you've got some ideas or some prototypes, putting that in front of players and seeing if they understand it and if it feels fun and if it feels like there's an experience here, has a huge amount of value. And then as you go through production, to making sure that you're looking at usability. Do people understand what you're making? Can they get through it? Making sure you're looking at tuning of difficulty and pacing as you get towards the end of post-production is hugely valuable. There's a few things that I'll send around after this call, and one of them is this, an idea of here's the type of objectives that you could be thinking about throughout development to inspire some of the things you want to learn. But the focus of today I wanted to talk about was how to make the most of your public playtest. Luckily, you've got this opportunity to put your game in front of players, and there will be some people that you can use for playtesters. Often finding playtesters is one of the hardest challenges, especially for teams who don't have a huge budget. And so it's great that you've got this lined up and you'll have some players in front of you. However, how do we make the most of that time? And I think that's what I want the focus of the next 20 minutes to be talking about some tips of how best to use the time with your players and what we can do with them when we have them. So my first tip, and the first thing that the challenge I see, is teams sometimes don't know what they want to learn from a playtest. They'll go into it thinking, well, we're doing this because playtesting is a thing you're meant to do, or we've hit a milestone, we've hit an alpha version, or hit a beta version, and because of that, we're going to run a playtest, which isn't the perfect mindset or perfect approach for playtesting. Often it can lead to unfocused studies, unfocused results, and getting data back that isn't that helpful. If you just spend a day and people chat about the graphics and say, yeah, the graphics were fine, that hasn't been a great return on investment of your time for doing this. So instead, we need to start as a team by thinking about what do we need to know today? What are the challenges that we currently have? What are we least certain about? What are the risks that we're most worried about in our games? And then use that to inspire what are we intending to learn from our playtest. I'll describe a process for that in a second. And as I mentioned, I've already covered this, but yeah, I end up talking to a lot of teams about their playtesting process, and often they fall into that habit of doing a big bundled up test where they want to learn everything about their game at that point. And again, that becomes too vague and too unhelpful. And instead, having smaller, more specific objectives that you want to learn from your test will help you get more value from it. So how to do that? I think the first thing we have to recognize is that every time we're making a decision for our game, we're making some assumptions about what players are going to do, what players are going to think, and what players are going to understand. That can be the core mechanics of the game. It could be describing, well, in this game, the health is going to be regenerative, or in this game, it's going to be mainly puzzles. And from that, we have an assumption about, well, players are going to understand that. That's going to be fun. That's going to work in the environment in which we're making. It can be a lot more granular than that. When you're working on level design, for example, or making an encounter in the game, you've got an assumption about what players will do and what players will think and how players will act. And yes, they might do that, or often they might not. And so we need to be making sure that we are articulating our hypotheses about what we want to learn whenever we're making decisions with our game. I think a first step for this would be you and your colleagues, the team you're working with, should have a chat about what decisions you're making currently, what's difficult, what are you not confident about, what do you think the biggest risks are currently, they're the points of failure for your game, and from that, what are your assumptions about player behavior? What do you think players are going to do? Once you've got that idea of what we think players are going to do, or how we think players are going to act, or what our biggest risks are, you can ask yourself some questions to work out, is this the most important thing we should be focusing on in our playtest? Or is this lower priority, something that we can leave till later, or doesn't matter if we don't put it in front of players? Some of the questions that I use to help teams prioritize what they should be focusing their playtests on is this a core part of the experience? If it's a core mechanic or a thing that players have to do time and time again, a thing the game is built around, that's probably more important than a secondary mechanic like changing your inventory or using the fast travel. Those are less important things and can be deprioritized. A second thing to think about, and again, this often catches teams out, is actually, can we make changes? If we learn problems with this, would we be able to act on it? Or have we built dependent systems on top of it and in fact would be stuck with it even if we learned there's a problem? And again, that can be a reason to deprioritize or prioritize something for playtesting. The last thing to think about is how confident you are about the thing. You obviously are all experienced game developers. You've spent a long time making things and prototyping before, and there are things that you've done lots of times and things that you haven't done lots of times before. And again, keeping that in mind helps you decide, is this a thing that we should focus our playtest on, or is it less important? To wrap up this first point though, I think the action, or my first recommended action, would be before your playtest, have that internal discussion on what are the biggest risks about your game, what are the things that you're most worried or most unclear on whether this will work or not, and agree this is our objective. This is what we want to learn from this upcoming playtest. Next. So you have some constraints on how you're going to gather data from your public playtests. And I've seen that there's a variety of genres. There's some multiplayer games, there's some VR games that when we talk one-to-one about your game and the challenges, we can go deeper. But for these kind of studies, often teams get the most value from just watching people play, getting one person, sitting them in front of the game and observing their natural behavior. Now, that's not the only method that you could be using. And again, as we talk about some of the specifics and some of the constraints, for example, for the multiplayer games that some of you are developing, there will be other methods will be appropriate. But because different methods have different strengths, you can think in advance about actually what kind of data is the safest to get from this kind of playtest. If you are relying quite heavily on observation and maybe a chance to have a short chat with them at the end with an interview, that's great for understanding, which point us towards usability. This might be a great opportunity to see, do players understand what they're meant to do? Do they understand where they're meant to go? What do they do in the game? And also a little bit about their opinions. What are their thoughts about the game? Although again, as we'll talk about in a minute, there are some caveats or some risks for that. And so I suspect from many of your studies that you'll be doing this public playtest, that focus on observing people play the game is where you'll get the most value. That as I've said, that means the data that is most reliable that you'll be getting back from these sessions are both their behavior, seeing what their natural behavior is in the game and what happens, and also a bit on their opinion. If you ask them at the end, what do they enjoy most? Where did they get confused? What do they enjoy least? That will start to throw up some interesting threads of actually what parts are players not understanding, what parts do players take away as a memorable part, and help you work out what you can optimize or where you can put your attention to maximize the fun in your experience. Again, one of the things I can send after is different goals work better for different methods. And again, from your public playtest, the understanding is where you're going to get the most benefit. Looking at, do players understand what they're meant to do in the game and how the game works, will give you incredibly reliable data from this session. And I've talked very briefly about, I'll talk about this very briefly. Obviously, as I've mentioned a few times, you can get a bit of opinion data. You can ask them at the end what they think and what they say. There'll be some caveats to that, some warnings because of the setting, because they somewhat know that you made the game. They're in a very public setting. They probably don't know you very well. When they give opinion findings, it's going to be filtered. They're not going to be as honest or as direct with you as they would if they were with their friends or in a different setting. And the amount of screening you're going to be able to do, checking whether they're the right kind of players, means that, again, we have to be slightly careful with the opinions that you'll be taking from this playtest. Luckily, a lot of that doesn't apply for behavior. So a strong focus on, do players understand these mechanics? Can they do it? Will make sure that you're getting very reliable data from this session. So again, I guess an action at the end of this section. In the previous section, you thought about what are the biggest risks and what are the things you want to learn from your test. I would also recommend, because you are already committed to doing one of these open play tests, is prioritizing the ones about behavior. If some of your questions are about, can players do this? Do players understand that? Where are they getting stuck? That's the kind of really valuable, rich data that you can get from this session. Okay. I know we're rattling through this very fast. We will have time for questions, and luckily it's being recorded as well. A third tip, or a third thing to think about, is making sure that you're matching the content, what you're showing players, to what you want to learn. Once you've had that chat about, here's what we want to learn from the game, and you've prioritized, here's our objectives, it then becomes a lot easier to decide, what do I want to put in front of players to generate the right data to see if they do understand that or if they can do it. That again can be an internal team chat. That can be a discussion of, actually, what do players need to do to answer this? If you're not sure if players learn from the tutorials how to use one of the mechanics, again, it becomes pretty obvious that you need to show players the tutorial. That becomes evident. If you're looking for where players get stuck in the game, again, that gives some ideas about what you need to show players or what players need to play through. For example, you might just want to let them go through a free play session. There's some objectives, such as what are players doing or where they're getting stuck. You might just want to let players play in the game. You might want to have a time-based play test where you say, if you can play the game for 8 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we'll have a quick chat about it at the end, might be the shape that your study takes. Alternatively, if your objectives need them to play specific bits, you might want to employ a more guided approach. You might want to show them some specific content and set them some tasks. So, for example, asking them, can you play through this level? Can you upgrade your character? Can you complete this tutorial for me? And then we'll have a chat about it. We'll help you answer those questions about understanding and what players can and can't do. Also be aware that some objectives will require background knowledge. If you're throwing players into a later part of the game or you haven't built the tutorials yet, there are some issues or some problems they're going to have that are just going to occur because they haven't seen or done a tutorial. How we always handled that, if the tutorial wasn't in and it wasn't part of what we want to learn from the session, is starting with a very brief primer for the player. So making a one-page sheet that says, here's the controls, here's what the tutorial would have taught you if there had been a tutorial, but we haven't built the tutorial yet. And giving players that as a reference sheet of paper or a reference introductory talk before they get to start playing. That means that you avoid just discovering problems that are only occurring because they haven't seen the tutorial, which isn't that useful, because in the real game, players are going to have done a tutorial before they get to the real content. And so your findings won't be so relevant. Again, to sum up some of these point, and the next action point would be decide what content your players need to see to answer your objectives. And then from that, decide what do you need to tell players beforehand? What would they have got from the tutorials? What will you be watching out for as they play? And how will you tell if it's working or if it's not working? And then what questions might you want to ask? This is a great opportunity to understand what's going on in players' heads, especially if they go the wrong way or do the wrong thing. By asking them questions to explain what's happening from their point of view, it can help you work out why they're getting the wrong idea or what's confusing about it, and then make the right intervention to fix it. Another thing I'll send after is I usually make it's called a moderation guide or a discussion guide, a one-page thing that I use to help guide the session that I have with me, that gives a prompt of, here's your introductory information I'm going to give the player, here's what I'm going to look out for while they're playing, here's some prompts for questions about what I might ask, and then a reminder of what questions I want to ask them at the end. And you can make that into a one-page sheet that you can just carry with you during the session, so to give that inspiration as you go through. Again, I'll send an example, one of these after the call, so everyone has a reference. Now, other things to watch out for. When you're doing the session, you have to be careful about leading the player. It's very easy to accidentally make players say what you want them to say. And again, that's not helpful. If you're just using this to get them to say nice things about your game because you want them to say nice things about your game, you're not mitigating risk and dealing with that experience risk we talked about earlier. And often that can be quite an unconscious trap that we fall into with how we ask questions or how we phrase questions or when we time questions that we need to look out for. A few examples or things to think about is, first of all, make sure you're making it okay to give negative feedback. If you play up your relationship with the game, you say how proud you are about what you've made, you tell them, I've spent ages working on this, it becomes very hard for someone to say, I didn't like it, or that wasn't very good. Obviously, there are lots of small things you have to do to manage that, and it's a lot about how you hold yourself in the session and your moderation. But an easy thing to do is at least make it explicit that you're open to negative feedback. Do tell them at the beginning, hey, it's okay to be honest. I'm really interested in your genuine thoughts and opinions, and it's useful to me if you tell me about difficult or confusing things. Another thing to watch out for is leading players on emotions, especially when you're asking about feelings about the game, like easy or hard or confusing or difficult. A small thing you can do is accidentally point them in the way you phrase a question towards a specific answer. If you ask, was the game easy? It's a lot easier for people to say it was easy than to contradict you and say, no, actually it was hard. When you're asking those kind of value statements, having a balancing the question. So if you're saying easy, also say hard, again, just helps avoid some of that little bias towards the players and pushing them in a certain direction. And again, watch out for revealing information and how you ask the question. If you said, why did players go the wrong way? You've revealed that players have gone the wrong way, and they might not have known they've gone the wrong way. And so often the questions that I end up asking end up being very bland, so that I'm not introducing new information the players don't have. For example, just saying, what's happening currently, or what's going on in the game, or what are you thinking currently, and then using their response as a open to a conversation and using their words and their framing, rather than me introducing concepts like saying the name of a thing in the game or giving away that they've done the wrong thing. And that's another thing that you can do in advance. And again, the template I'll send over will have some inspiration of what are some bland questions you can ask that aren't giving away information, but do encourage players to talk about what they're doing as they go through the game. A few more tips: being very careful with helping players. When you've finally made your game and you release it into the wild, unfortunately, you won't be there with the game to help players. So the game has to stand by itself. That might mean that, and to get the most value from your playtest, you'll also want to make sure that you are letting the game stand for itself. That might mean you have to let one player struggle, that player who's in front of you at that time. But if seeing that player struggle and seeing how they think and how they overcome it inspires your fix that will fix it for everyone who buys your game, that's worth doing. There are some occasions where you might want to step in if, as we talked about tutorials, there's something explanatory that's missing. You might want to step in and be the tutorial because you know that will be in the tutorial. If you've seen this issue 100 times and you and all your colleagues also you agree this is a problem, and because you've seen it so much, you know we need to fix it. Again, maybe that can be a time to step in so that you can learn new and interesting problems by moving on beyond this one. But yeah, if it's neither of those, you should be very careful about stepping in. Instead of stepping in to help them, instead you can get a lot of value just by asking them to describe what they think is happening, get players to say what's going on in the game in their mind and what they think is happening. And again, that can give all those clues about why have they gone the wrong way or what's going wrong. So my action here is hesitate before helping players. I do have a couple more. I'm sorry, I'm aware I'm going to go 2 or 3 minutes over. Finishing the session with a small interview. As I talked about, you get a huge amount of value just by watching people play, but understanding what's going on in players' heads will also give a huge amount of information too. So, for example, some very quick questions that you can wrap up on is asking them, overall, what did you think about the game? What was their favorite thing? What was their least favorite thing? If they could change one thing, what would they change about the game? And the point with some of these things is not to go and do it. Don't you are the game designer and you are the game developer. And just because a player tells you, oh, you should, I don't know, introduce a shotgun into the game, you shouldn't immediately go and do it. But it should give you pause for thought of why are players asking for the shotgun? Actually, what is the problem that they've encountered and what's leading them to give that feedback? And then you can apply your design expertise to work out, okay, the appropriate fix for the problem that they're describing would be taking this other action. And again, preparing that in advance is a thing that I can share in the template after. Piloting your playtest, making sure that you have a go at doing it before you take it into the live environment. I think I've spent tens of thousands of hours of playtesting and something always goes wrong. The game will crash, the build won't have the same things in that you expect it to have in. When you ask your question out loud, you realize this question doesn't make any sense. Players are going to go somewhere that you didn't expect, or something will go wrong, or the fire alarm will go off. There will be problems you can't anticipate. You can find some of those in advance by just having a practice session before you run your playtest. That will be getting a friend, getting them in front of the game and pretend to be someone who doesn't know you, and just run through what you're going to do with a player and how it's going to work, and then notice those things where your session didn't quite work, or your question didn't work, or the build didn't actually have the tutorial in that you thought it had, so that you can fix those before you go and take it live. And my last tip is about note taking. So ideally, if you've got the capacity to, you might want to record what's happening during the sessions. You might want to screen record for all the sessions and see what's happening so that you can go back and study it later on. However, that's not always possible. You might have, if you are recording and depending on what you're recording, you might have to think about consent for recording, and that introduces some complications. And so an alternative for many setups might be just trying to take some notes live. Now, again, I talked about that idea of having a one-page thing that you hold during the session that will give you a prompt for, here's a task I'm going to ask, here's the questions I'm going to ask, here's what I'm going to watch out for. And again, you can create some space on that. You can create an area to capture, okay, what did this player actually do that was interesting, your behavioral observations, and then what they said, their opinions and what they gave back at the game. And printing off one of these one pages per participant, having a clipboard might be enough and help you make sure you're capturing the rich data from your session. As I mentioned, I'll send some things after. There's that list of actions I've mentioned all the way through, but I can send the full version of the report so you have that. There's a little guide of here's some steps to think about before your playtest and the process you should go through to doing it. I mentioned that the different objectives that might change throughout development. And also I'll send over a template version of a one-page sheet that you can take into the sessions with you. I've gone 3 minutes over, I'm sorry, but what we'll do now, I think, is we'll have a look and have a chat about some specific playtest setups and questions. And also, if you have questions after, my email address is here. Do stay in touch. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think this was very helpful and probably eye-opening how optimization of a playtest and a thoughtful playtest can enhance your further process in developing and finishing your game. So we will stop the recording by now. So we will provide this recording to you or to all of you so you can watch in the aftermath.